I'm Traci Austin, your host of the People Strategy Podcast. This show provides interviews with organizational leaders and ongoing coaching experiences that highlight elevating people in organizations through a people strategy roadmap. You are in for a treat this week. I am thrilled to introduce you to Marcia Barnes. Marcia is the CEO and founder of Valve and Meter. And Valve and Meter is a performance marketing organization. But here's the deal with Marcia. She is the real deal. She genuinely cares about people that she works with, ensuring that they are in their right role, but also really loved on in a way that they perform at their highest level. And that's incredibly felt throughout the organization. She's an amazing storyteller. And you're going to hear through today's episode of how she weaves her beliefs in the clarity of the core values through the organization, through the behaviors and everything that is done from hiring staff to serving clients, and really taking care of her people in a way that elevates them to be able to perform their best work. So with that, you are again in for a treat with this episode with Marcia Barnes. Thanks so much. Why is growing an organization and people so important and personal to you?
I started early in life, like even in like 4-H and in my church activities and stuff, of being someone who took great joy in talking folks into joining 4-H or church and stuff, and so I kind of got a taste of growing organizations that way that followed me into business. But growth, I find I'm reminded very clearly today of why growth is important. Here at Valve and Meter, when we went through 2020 and 2021 with COVID, it kind of set our growth trajectory off a bit to where we thought we'd be by today, right? We're doing great, but when you're not growing at the right pace, then your people don't get the right opportunities to move up and get promoted. Like I had a team member recently go to work somewhere else, left Valve and Meter and went somewhere else. And it was totally the right thing for him to do because he was ready for his next role. And I didn't have that role ready because we're not growing at the right pace, right? So that's one thing I would say it's important about growth. It causes the culture of a business to be more engaging and exciting and moving folks forward. Growth's important to make sure you're staying ahead of inflation and not getting your business stagnant. It's important to be able to have access to capital and in order to grow your business. So I think trying to run a business with having no growth strategy, you probably need to get into another business.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, that growth strategy not only feeds the revenue, but also kind of feeds that people strategy as to what is that upward momentum and what is that momentum that we need to bring new folks in.
Mhm.
And so when you kind of look at that, one of the things that you've stated in your book, which is Here We Grow, was being a conqueror versus a victim. And there were so many conversations in 2020 around the pandemic and like, for me and this and that is that victim mindset versus that conqueror mindset. I'm curious, how are you pulling that in and how has that impacted your people strategy?
The conqueror and victim piece actually gets its underpinning in humility. It's very important that leaders exhibit very good humility and balance in their life. So if you look at the continuum of humility, on the far left, you have the person who thinks they do everything right and the ideas are the only ones that matter and they always are going to win and they're the best that there is. And then on the other extreme of that, you have this person who doesn't think they do anything right and they don't have what it takes and they're very discouraged and don't see a path forward in things most of the time. And so this person on the right or I'm using my hands, I know we're in a podcast, but when you're in that mindset that you don't have what it takes, or there's things about you that are not valuable and you haven't learned to love yourself well, you become a victim. And so the other extreme where you think you're the best at everything, you're an ass over on that side. So what we want to do is we want to move to the middle. We want to move the victim to the middle where they can be a conqueror, where they're standing firmly in humility, understanding that they're perfectly created to do something that's been put in their heart to get out into the marketplace or the world, that they're confident that they can win, they can build teams, they can add value. You need to stay in that place, and that place is going to have you grounded in humility and looking around for who you can serve.
I love that because it's really looking at that self-awareness, right? And it's like that shift from being self-conscious to being self-aware.
Right.
So, as a leader of several organizations and growing several organizations, how do you instill that into your leadership team and all the way through the folks within your organization?
So, what I find is that if we begin with loving one another, we can help people understand that they have value. And when we love one another, we have this desire to serve them, right? And when we're loving and serving well, people give us permission to lead. And then that causes us to have transformational results. I can't get transformational results from a talent on our team unless I'm loving them well and serving them well. Then once I have that permission, we're off to the races. So I'm looking for folks that show up with humility, have a heart for service, who have shown the ability to go from here to there on things in their life, who can lead and follow. Sometimes you need to be leading and sometimes you need to be following. Even if you're the CEO like me, there's most of my day needs to be spent following something that the team is needing me to do. So I can't just focus on leading all the time. Then we want to hire based on how that's what we can tell about how people are showing up. And then the biggest thing I see in not being able to drive this through a culture is that we don't talk about it enough or point it out when somebody's doing it well.
Definitely that doing well.
Right.
So often we're talking about what's not being done versus celebrating the successes.
Right. And sometimes that goes outside of our doors. Last year, we had one of our team members' daughter was expecting a baby, and that daughter that was expecting a baby was living with our team member too. And the baby was going to be due in about 3 weeks, and the mother needed to go to Nashville for a family wedding. And so she went to Nashville, and about 10 o'clock at night, when she got to Nashville on a Friday, the daughter goes into labor, and they can't find anybody in the family to take her to the hospital. So she called the VP of HR to see if he might have the solution, like a connection that would be available. And he ended up going and meeting the girl at the hospital to take care of her 3-year-old daughter while her new baby was being born. And about 10 minutes before the baby was born, then the other team, the grandmother, ended up getting to the hospital. And then, so I just thought that was a tremendous act of sacrifice, humility, because it's like 2 a.m., right, when this is all going on.
Right.
So he made that effort and did the above and beyond expectation. But then other team members came around them over the next days and put the baby bed together because the baby wasn't supposed to be there yet, right? So
Right.
put the
Right.
baby bed together and brought supplies and things that they needed in. There were several people doing that, and that's loving and serving one another well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other side of that too is the amount of trust within the organization for a team member to call the VP of HR at 2 a.m. and be okay with that. That's
Right.
amazing
Mhm.
within how that's woven through the culture. That's incredible.
Mhm.
And so you've talked a lot about culture throughout our conversations so far today, and it really is woven as kind of a key theme throughout the book. And I'm curious, how do those values guide behaviors and impact business results? And we just had a story of how they definitely guide behaviors,
Right.
but how do, ensuring that you've got the clarity and the behaviors and the expectations around those also drive those business results?
Well, I think we do a good job here at Valve and Meter of communicating what the values are. And then we've put a lot of context around what they look like in action. In fact, I was just walking back here to my desk to do this interview with you. And on the community monitors, it was rotating the 5 cultural behaviors here at Valve and Meter with the scripting of what each of those meant. So there's constant visual reminders. A lot of our conversations about what good looks like or guiding decisions are around those five behaviors. So think, love, serve, transform, and be just. And probably the one that I always cringe a little bit when somebody says, when we're trying to make a decision, well, if I look at what's just in this situation, because I know they're going to come with something that I didn't think of because that's not my normal. I orient towards being just, but it's not in a problem solving. I think it's a good definition of asking that question. What
Right.
is the just response here? So a few years ago, we had maternity leave and paternity leave, and we have 3 weeks of vacation, and we have floating holidays, and we have service days. We have a lot of days off, it seems like. And someone's father passed away, and then a grandfather like a month later, and they asked me about bereavement leave. And I said, I think we've got enough days off to be able to handle that already. And the team member responded, I appreciate the days off that we have, but in the context of our culture, that didn't seem real just to me, which caused me then to say, okay, that's a good point. So we ended up adding a couple days of bereavement for certain deaths in a family, right?
And I love how it's woven through all of our policies, right? Because those policies are also reflective, whereas every decision is run through those specific core values. So let's chat about the pandemic a little bit. This kind of goes back to the conqueror versus the victim, and
Right.
again, into the core values. So the pandemic, I think, had impact on everyone in one way or another. And one of the impacts on the workplace had to do with, are we all going remote? What does hybrid look like? What does
Mhm.
it look like with us in the office? What's the impact on mental health? And so, what is that holistic approach that you really looked at, paying very specific attention to the statistics, going back to think, right?
Right.
And also ensuring that you are doing things in the best interest of employees and the organization.
Prior to the pandemic, Tracy, if you tested people for anxiety and depression, 15% of the population would test that they had anxiety or depression, some level of that. And then after 2020 happens and COVID, that went up to 40%. If you tested the same population, 40% instead of 15 now have anxiety and depression. And a couple months ago, I was in a session that Dr. Henry Cloud was presenting, and he's got a new book out on trust that I haven't read it yet, but he was talking about it, and it was very, very good content. What he said that I was not aware of is today in 2023, 3 years after this thing happened to us, when you test that population, it's still 40% that are hanging on to anxiety and depression. And there's something very deep that did not reset in our psyche to be able to shed that off. So that causes me to look. I've got a team of 50 people. It means 30 of them are having some sort of issue with depression and anxiety. And what could we do to support that? So I've just kind of started to layer some things in. But one of the things we did was we bought a block of hours from a person that does coaching, and he's good on helping people with stress and burnout and also developing their careers. And he's just a really good coach that I had known for several years. And so our employees can go to him and schedule an hour to talk with him, and they can talk about anything they want: personal, professional, business, life, whatever they need. And that is by far, I think, our most favorite benefit that we have here at Valve and Meter. The team really likes that opportunity to have somebody, a resource they can kind of talk through these things with. I recently brought on a stress coach that's going to be working with us in 2024 to help our team learn best practices for exercises and ways to avoid or eliminate stress triggers. There have been times when some of our people have openly struggled with this depression piece. And we've brought the teams come around them to be encouraging and to help them walk through what the resources are that can help with that. And I think it's required us to be more candid and open, emotionally open in our conversations so that we're not putting people in a position where they feel like they have to hide it.
Mhm.
Hiding depression and anxiety to me makes it a lot worse.
Yeah, amazing. And I love how you're really looking at, what do our folks need? You're taking the feedback and saying this is helping them to move forward. And it's really looking at that. We're taking care of the person holistically
Yeah.
versus just who shows up in the office from 9 to 5, because we
Right.
are that whole pot of soup.
Yeah, you got to deal with a whole person and a whole job. We have some team members that live out of state. They come in about quarterly. They'll come in to spend some time on the ground here, but for the most part, they're not somebody we're going to see in person every day. So that, to me, I think this whole space of remote and hybrid and in office, we don't yet know what the best practices are. We're trying to figure it out as we go along. I think they look like they always have to stay connected, to affirm people, to repeat, you've got what it takes. You're not your past, you're your future. You're the find of a lifetime. You know, to really pour into folks. I find that I get much better results when I'm focused on what people are doing right and their strengths than I am when I'm pointing out where they're deficient at, right?
Absolutely. That turning up the strengths and then creating that team where we can elevate strengths because one person's weakness is another's strengths for
Right.
sure. And so I want to shift a little bit into recruitment. So, Valvometer is a marketing firm. And so recruitment is really marketing and it's marketing people to our organization. And that happens at all different stages. So I'm really curious when you kind of look at recruitment to bring the best folks into your organization and how you market, how do you ensure that you're bringing the best people in and that you have clarity over the role that you're hiring for?
That's a great question. So, my first step in recruiting is to write out what is the position we're recruiting for. I think Jonathan Reynolds does a good job in his book, Right Seats, Right People.
He does an amazing job talking
Right.
about that. And
Yeah.
he's been on our show before as well.
Yeah. And which is something I've done for probably about 20 years is I was taught in a session about recruiting and interviewing. Before you do the first interview, write out what are the 5 most important attributes for your winning candidate to have, and then create a scorecard of those 5 attributes. And to do that before you start the first interview, because if you don't, you will talk to somebody who's kind of cool or you get excited about, but they're not the whole of what it was that you were looking at. And so you start to reorient the position towards the person that you're interviewing. That, instead of knowing, here's what it is I need, and then measuring against that. So then when we have that, then the other thing I do is I pray that we'll get the right people in and that we'll know it when we see it. That seems
Right.
to work pretty
Absolutely.
well for us. Some positions in marketing are very difficult to hire for. We're really blessed here because I've been impressed by every single person that's been coming into the business the last several years, and I really don't do very much interviewing today unless it's a leadership team position we're bringing in. But the team is really recruiting very well.
And my listeners are going to go, what's your secret sauce to that?
Well, if you have a leadership team and a team around them that match the culture and have the same heart and the same vision, and not everybody's going to, right? But if you're heavy in the balance of people being aligned with what you're trying to bring into the marketplace, it becomes much easier to attract that talent. Like attracts like. People who are doing your interviews should be someone you would hire, right, on the team.
Right.
It should be the ideal person you would hire on the team. Years ago, when I was running an organization that had a couple thousand employees in it, the recruiting positions we would hire professional recruiters for. And there was one position that was the biggest numbers in our business, 1,200 people on an outside sales job, sales technicians. The person who's trying to recruit for those, their career is recruiting, right? They were not hiring people who would stick. So what I did was I brought a manager who had entered the business in that position of a security technician and now was managing a team. I brought him into the recruiting position, and that changed overnight on the quality of the technicians that we were hiring.
Because it's that personal experience, that story, the
Yeah.
passion for the business.
Yeah.
And so, as we just shift a little bit about recruitment and ensuring that we're getting the outcomes that we're looking for, you talk a little bit about the math of marketing in your book, Here We Grow, and the importance of what we focus on. And we've heard really clearly today the key things that you're focusing on, pouring into your employees, core values, etc. So I'm curious, what is your mindset around focusing on costs versus outcomes? Because that was a key piece within there. And the reason I'm asking this question is so often I will hear in businesses, well, people are so expensive and they're so this and they're so that. And that mindset around that, I believe, impacts the outcomes. And what I hear you talk about is every person coming in is really doing a great job. And we know exactly what we're looking for in the outcomes. So I'm curious around your mindset between costs versus outcomes.
Yeah. So I think of it the same way I would think about marketing. Cost is relative to results. So in the digital marketing world, you can bring a customer in using paid media, Google AdWords, sponsored ads. And what you're going to get in that, because it's so competitive, is you might get a return on marketing spend. Maybe you have a goal of hitting $4 back for every dollar you put into marketing. But on that one, you're going to get $3 back for every dollar you put into marketing. On the organic side of building out SEO and content, things like that, you'll put a dollar in and get back $16 to $18. But people get so focused on wanting to do PPC because it's at the top of the page, they lose track of the results are much better with SEO. So that's kind of how I think about it, is let's test and invest in the things that are working for us. When we get to people, recently I was in a session at an event where they were talking about doing strategic hires to your team. Like you need to add some capabilities or a new line of business, but there's a hire that needs to be made to do that. And we get kind of squeamish about that on the front end as a business making that decision. So let's say it's an $80,000 position. We don't know that we're going to have the budget to do the 80,000. How do we forecast what the value of bringing that person in is? And I thought that this teacher had a good point, that look at the position as, can it add 3 to 10 times its value over the base? So if the base wage was $80,000, are they going to be able to bring in over the next 12 to 18 months $240 to $800,000 worth of gross profit or profit, however you want to measure that? And I thought that was a good way to view it, because you're not making an $80,000 decision. If the person is not right for the job, you're going to know it in that 3 to 6 month range. And so you're probably putting at risk about 40,000. But if the outcome is possibly, $700,000 or $800,000, then I probably get real comfortable with adding that position. But we also need to hold the position accountable for doing that. What I find people don't do is go back and double check their guess on what they thought that person would do for the business.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
What are the outcomes that we're getting from this, and where do we need to make the tweaks, and what does the individual need, and are they the right person for that role?
Yeah, I've probably hired 10,000 people in my career. I've spent $500 million on marketing. A lot of times I was the person who was signing that paycheck, right? And a lot of times I'm the person who's signing the check for the marketing. You tend to learn really quickly what works and what doesn't when that happens.
Absolutely. And so I'm curious, as we wrap up today, what is one challenge that you have for listeners based on our conversation? What's one thing that they can do to really get a significant result?
My default is always going to be kind of the same, because I don't know how to win without doing it. But you've really got to get comfortable loving people and their work. Anything you can do to show gratitude, to show belief in them, to show that you're confident that they're going to win, to help them along that path. Start with love. From my Christian worldview, loving one another as we love ourselves is a commandment. It's not part of a 10-step program or a suggested list of to-dos. It is truly the most important thing. And so walking in love throughout your work, I don't know how to do it without doing that, to do it successfully without doing that.
Amazing. And I agree 100%, because when we love those people around us and they feel that appreciation, they're going to be much more engaged, and they're going to want to ensure that they're serving you because you're pouring so much into them.
Right. I find so many people in business and business owners, they get a lot of fear going around, feeling like they don't have what it takes. And I just want you to know that you've got what it takes, that you've been perfectly created to deliver something into the marketplace that's going to reflect God's character and create abundance. And I would just bat that fear aside and don't let that voice win.
That is amazing. That's amazing. And I think that was one of the first call outs in your book as well. It was like, every person's created perfectly. So make sure that you are fulfilling that by what you're doing every day, because you're going to love life so much more then as well.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, Marcia, thank you so much for being with us. And in the show notes, we will have a link to your book and ways that folks can follow you if they're interested in learning more about you or Valve and Meter. And I so appreciate your time here today.
Great. It was a pleasure to chat again.
Oh my goodness. I don't know about you, but that conversation with Marcia was absolutely amazing. And I want to highlight a couple of the key points that I took away from this conversation that you can really impact your business with. And right in the opening, one of the things that Marcia stated was your organization has to grow at the right pace. And why is that so important as a people strategy? Well, guess what? As people in organizations, we typically want to grow. And when we are growing in our organization, we are essentially creating pathway plans through the organization. So, as an individual, I have a career trajectory, I have career choices that I'm making. And as an organization, I want to meet my folks where they're at to truly create that career with them so that they have an opportunity to grow within the organization. And as Marcia shares with us, is that if the organization is not growing at that pace, individuals end up leaving because there's no longer the growth within the organization. So that's really key into how you're setting your people strategy and what that looks like as you grow folks and grow the company. The second point that was incredibly important in this episode is how core values are woven into every single thing that Marcia's doing. So, very specifically into her beliefs and her thoughts, but also the core values are in front of folks. They're utilized in the interview, they're utilized with clients and customers. Anyone who's coming into the organization knows what those core values are. And a very specific examples of what it looks like in the day-to-day behaviors. And that's a key challenge that I would have for our listeners is how are your core values integrated into the day-to-day of the organization? And do you use those core values as a filter into how you make your business decisions? And then the third item that I really wanted to point out here is when you're doing recruiting and really thinking about recruiting, how are you determining what that math is to say, hey, this is a great addition to our organization or not? And so Marcia talks a lot about the math of marketing. And here we're talking about the math of recruitment, which is are your positions adding 3 to 8 times the value to the business over the base? So, with that, thank you so much for listening in today. Be sure to follow Marcia, grab the book, the show notes, etc., so that you can follow her. And if you have not already, please give us a 5-star review and let us know what you're thinking about our show. Have a great one.